Alrighty, so it is the top of the hour. Again, thank you so much to everyone for joining us today for this very special open studio session. We have the absolute pleasure today of having two guest facilitators who I am now going to introduce and read you some of their bios, frankly, because they're just so impressive and we're so grateful to have them with us. So we have Mackenzie Pish, who is the program manager for the University of Arizona Law School's Innovation for Justice program. I4J is a social justice lab that uses design and systems thinking methodologies to design, build, and test disruptive solutions to the justice gap. This year, Mackenzie is co-teaching a course that is applying systems thinking to a challenge frame as legal empowerment for low-income people experiencing medical debt. Mackenzie received her JD from the University of Arizona Law School in 2020, where she was a distinguished scholar, an editor on the Arizona Law Review, and a recipient of the S. Thomas Chandler Public Service Award. She received her BA in political science from State of New York, Cortland. So thank you so much, Mackenzie, for being with us today. And our second guest facilitator is Alexandria Cedar. And Alexandria is a Peacebuilder specializing in systems thinking, international development, and public health. Her work is centered in cultivating collaboration and trust among stakeholders, and she has worked across disciplines and world regions. Currently, she is a systems change consultant. She is also a mentor for Engineers Without Borders at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the vice chair of Engineers Without Borders USA's Committee on Project Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. Alexandria received her master's in sustainable peace building from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she was an advanced opportunity fellow and an instructor for the introduction to peace building and conflict resolution. So thank you both so much for being here. And I know that this session is really special because both Alexandria and Mackenzie will tell you more about their background and their journeys to becoming systems thinkers. So you might be wondering, what brings us together? How do we know these two fabulous women? So I'm holding up this, can't really see it because of my background, there we go, Makes Meaningful Connections Habits card. And I'm holding it up because it's so relevant. The reason we came to know them is by really forming and cultivating these meaningful connections. So Alexandria was a participant in the Water Center Leading for Impactful Change Studio Series course. And it was during that course that she really emerged as a leader and was a mentor to many of her fellow classmates, which is wonderful. And our Chief Learning Officer, Sherry Marlin, has spoken at the University of Arizona Law School several times. And it's through those speaking engagements that we were introduced to Mackenzie. So thank you so much for being here. I'm not going to take up any more of your time because we have, you have a lot planned. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alexandria and Mackenzie.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Alexis. We are excited to be here too. Drea and I have been talking nonstop about how we're excited for this new community of systems thinkers and also just excited to share our experiences with each other. So I think that's where we're going to start, is just to talk about our journeys to systems thinking and how systems thinking came into our work and how we use it now, because those are kind of different. And we're also going to save questions for the end. Drea, do you want to start?
Sure. So I guess the first time I heard the term systems thinking was during my undergrad at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The class was focused more on systems mapping, and it was with Rob Rosigliano. So I knew he was pretty well known in peace building, and I really wanted to make a good impression and just soak everything up and leave a master of systems thinking. And everything went completely over my head. I even did all the readings. I asked for help. I tried to do everything, and I was just so overwhelmed, and I really didn't get it. But I wanted to get it eventually. I just never thought, I thought maybe 20 years from now or something I would. But around the same time, I was selected to travel with Engineers Without Borders at UWM, my university, to translate and do their community development work in their projects in Guatemala. And that's where I kind of started seeing systems thinking. And I realized it wasn't just these theories and mapping, but it was just kind of recognizing connections between different parts of the community and the ripple effect of action. So for example, when we build water systems in a community, that yes, there's improved access to water, but it also affects, health and gender and how time's spent and other aspects of life. So it started clicking for me in Guatemala, but the course is what really gave me the lens to start seeing those things as systems thinking.
That's interesting because my intro to systems thinking was also in academia, but it actually wasn't until my last year of law school, which was only a year ago. So systems thinking as a concept is pretty new to me. But instead of just learning I don't have like a huge background in systems thinking, but what we did instead was we learned a snapshot of systems thinking, actually through the habits of systems thinking. And we took that and we applied it to a social justice program or social justice problem. So the course that I took was called Innovation for Justice, and it's a course offered to graduate students of all disciplines, but mostly it's hosted at the law school, so it's a lot of law students. But it teaches us to use design and systems thinking and apply to different social problems that vary semester from semester. Design thinking is like a 5-stage process, which in a nutshell is just, we lead with empathy. We go out into the community and we try to understand a problem from the point of view of the people experiencing. We check what we know about the problem, or we think we know about the problem, at the door, and we really get out there and try to understand it from their point of view. And then we come back and we unpack what we've learned and we ideate creatively. We don't jump to the first solution that comes to our mind. And then when we think we have an intervention point, when we think we have a solution, we bring it back out to the community before we invest any time and resources in it. But when we're talking about a really complex system, for example, that first semester, we were dealing with human trafficking, and our challenge was framed as meeting the needs of human trafficking survivors. We're not going to meet the needs of human trafficking survivors in a very complex system if we only talk to human trafficking survivors. So instead, we had to take a no-violence approach and talk to all stakeholders, from people who identified as traffickers or pimps to human trafficking survivors, to people who meet their needs, to police officers who engage with survivors, to judges. And we had to understand the point of view from all of their perspectives to come and say, where is their consensus? Where is their opportunity to deliver impact? So while I don't have a huge extensive background in systems thinking, I just took a deep dive into applying systems thinking to work right away.
Right, and I imagine having to balance all those perspectives probably felt like a little overwhelming at first, for sure, especially that's a tall order for a semester, right? And I know we had talked about a little bit before, that was kind of like our first feeling of it was overwhelming. And I think especially when you start seeing all of the system and these connections, and I definitely felt that way when I was getting my master's in sustainable peace building at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. But what really helped me feel less overwhelmed was doing work with community partners similar to yourself. So in the MSP, or Masters of Sustainable Peace Building, most of our classes had a project attached to a community partner, and we had to do 2 extensive fieldwork placements during the summer. And that's what really helped me recognize that there really is no one right or wrong way to do systems thinking, which frankly is very contrary to everything I was taught in academia up to that point. I came into my master's with a strong research background, and it was all about proving something right or wrong, or supporting a hypothesis. And I thought systems thinking was like that. I thought there was this one way written in some books, and I had to follow this formula. And yes, there are guidelines, and the tools and books are definitely helpful. Still read them, but it's not really this specific discipline as much as it's a way of thinking that you can apply across disciplines. And the focus isn't finding the right answer either, or finding a solution, again, contrary to everything I'd been taught, but on understanding the system and helping others understand the system so the stakeholders involved can work towards something together. And that really came to light, especially in my work in Ecuador, where I did 2 projects with ICIAM University, located in the Amazonian rainforest. So one of my projects was creating a theoretical framework for an international water center that would be used by both UNESCO and the Water's Future area in in Australia, and how to be inclusive of all the stakeholders that would be affected, including local populations, indigenous people, government, international government, things like that. And then the other was to study the impact of the decreased use of a traditional agroforestry method called a chakra among the Quechua people. And like I said, both of those required me to do a lot of stakeholder interviews, but especially with different indigenous groups that resided in their ancestral land in the Amazonian rainforest. And that's what really changed everything for me. One interview in particular with Tuntiak Katan, he's a leader of the Shuar people. we were talking about these different conservation efforts, and he had actually gotten a degree in ethnobotany too, and went back to live in the Amazon with his people. And he said, you know, it's really crazy to me that all of these outsiders are coming in and telling us how to protect the forest and how to conserve it. And I think that's crazy because we know how to do this. We've been doing it for centuries. We know that I can't take this much from this tree because it only produces this much cycle, and we need the forest and it needs us. And that was a powerful conversation for many reasons, but that conversation and those projects really made me realize that systems thinking, it's not this new thing. In fact, it's very old. I mean, case in point, there are people who still live like that, the way their ancestors did for many, many years before them. And before my master's, I really framed everything through that first course and those readings. And again, helpful, but now I see systems thinking as something inherent to us. It's part of nature, and so are we. So our species, along with other living things on Earth, survived because we knew how connected we were and interdependent we were on each other. And now I see systems thinking, you know, in my consultancy and my teaching, that it's not a matter of teaching people systems thinking, it's reconnecting them with it.
I think that's an interesting way to look at it, because I think as a discipline coming into it right away, feeling like I don't have a lot of academic experience in it, it's a little bit intimidating. And when you put it in the perspective of this is something natural, this is something normal, and then you just use system thinking tools as in that language as a tool to relearn that and to really apply that and to reteach yourself, I think that's super powerful. Because I know, like you, in my academic background, I think I was trained, get the right answer and get it fast. And that's how you know that you're smart. You know, you get 100%, that's good. You get 98, like what can you do to get 100%? But this is not, when I got to law school, I felt like I had that same similar experience at first. It was about getting the right answer and reiterating the right answer. That's why I fell in love with I4J, because it applied design and system thinking. And what we said was, don't jump to a solution. Like that was nailed down on my head. Don't be so quick to jump to finding a solution or an answer. The goal is just to try to understand. And I think a perfect example of that is our work in eviction. We created a tool called the Eviction Calculator. Before I get into that, let me back up a little bit. We knew that eviction was a really complex human problem. Evictions on the family level, they disrupt houses, they lead to homelessness, job loss, mental and physical health problems. And those consequences are long and lasting. And we really wanted to try to make impact and reduce eviction. So our lawyer brain, my lawyer brain, quick jumps to, well, this is such a big problem. We just need decision makers to understand that it's a problem and we need them to care so that they invest in housing stability. But I'm making a huge assumption there that decision makers don't already know that it's a problem and they don't care. And by checking my assumptions and checking my own mental models and then talking to decision makers, talking to legislators and asking them what they feel about this problem, I learned that they do care. They're just hearing about 10 different problems from 10 different stakeholders, and they have limited funds and they don't see the connection. So taking what we learned from that, we're able to zoom out and think, okay, there's all of these things that happen after eviction to families. What if we highlighted all of those other costs that come into play, all of those other systems that are affected by eviction? And what if we spotlight those? Then not only do we highlight, well, if you spent money on eviction and housing or preventing eviction, you would decrease costs to shelter, medical care, child welfare systems, but also you bring all of those stakeholders to the table who all have a common interest in stopping eviction and helping those services. And you bring them to the table and have them talk about how they get them out of their silos and talk about decision making and how you can deliver impact. Oh, and if you're interested in the Eviction Calculator and other system thinking tools that we're using to inform our eviction works, I will share this link in the chat now.
That's perfect, because speaking of resources, Mackenzie and I, we saw what you all put when you signed up, and that you really wanted to learn how to apply systems thinking to your work or apply it to more unique situations. So we're going to talk a little bit about our process, give some examples, and we're going to frame that through the Water Center's Habits of a Systems Thinker, because for us, it's just a really great way to explain all the different steps and complexity that comes with doing systems work. There should be a link in the chat. We can make sure we put that in for you. And definitely don't feel like you have to follow along with us, but you certainly can. We won't get to talking about all of them, so we just want you to have that link so you can use those in the future. For both of us, one of our main goals when we start is to understand the system, starting with the stakeholders, but most importantly, to really show up with empathy and lead with empathy. And a big part of that in systems thinking in general is that self-awareness. So the habits are a great way to look at complex situations, but they can also serve as great self-reflection prompts, like testing assumptions, for example. When you come to a conclusion, ask yourself, what made me think this? What are some past experiences, or what have I heard that made me come to that conclusion right away? And have I checked it? Have I asked somebody? Have I asked somebody from the outside or in the system to verify whether or not that's true? One example, I was doing a project with one of my colleagues, Linda Shang, in Guatemala. We did a women's meeting and they were kind of quiet, and we were like, oh gosh, is the translation wrong? Because we were doing in Shield, a Spanish to English translation. And we're like, oh, did we say something culturally wrong? Why are they being so quiet? And we found out later it was because they felt self-conscious that they couldn't speak Spanish with us, or some of them felt self-conscious because they were missing teeth. And fortunately, we were able to amend that. And the questions we had were actually great and led to a great conversation. But had we not tested that assumption, we wouldn't have been able to get all that information. And that's just like one small example. And I think another really key point to increasing understanding and empathy and self-awareness is, changing your perspectives. So when you're looking out, so zooming out and looking at a complex situation, important to ask, what are the other ways people are seeing this? What perspectives are at the table that may be different than mine? And then asking yourself, doing that zooming in, that inner reflection piece, am I truly open to understanding other points of views? And when I asked this question, including myself, most people's like, yeah, totally. I'm very open to other people. But what if it's somebody whose values are different? Or in this current climate, whose political views are in contrary to yours? Can you see their side? Can you sit with them and build community? And if you can't answer yes to that question, then find somebody who can. Find a team member. Mackenzie and I do a lot of our work with diverse teams in a lot of ways, including transdisciplinary. But that's something too that, to be a systems thinker and Peacebuilder, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all these answers and be able to entertain everything and just be this empty vessel that is open to everything. It's okay to have things that you can't, perspectives that you can't see, but you need that team. And that team, what it brings is these different mental models, which I actually have the cards right here. Those different mental models coming in. And mental models are just beliefs and attitudes that influence those perspectives and actions that are based in a lot of things, like how we grew up, where we went to school, our life experiences. And a big part of the work isn't just understanding your own mental model and doing that reflection, or understanding the mental model of the people around you or in the system, but helping people in the system understand that those mental models are what's driving actions. And I think, Mackenzie, you talked a lot of that came up in your work with the medical debt, correct?
Yeah, so our current work that we're doing right now, it's the challenge framed as legal empowerment for people experiencing medical debt. And we're working in Utah, where Utah has reduced, they're one of two states that have relaxed their restriction on who can practice law with an access to justice purpose of providing legal advice and assistance to people who otherwise couldn't afford it. So we're working in that system, but we're also working with medical debt, which is a complex system on its own. We know that in the legal sphere, if you're just zooming into the legal system of medical debt, more than 70% of people who are sued for medical debt don't even show up to court. And that results in default judgments that lead to wage garnishments that just exacerbate the financial stress that started the whole process in the first place. So when we as lawyers, mostly lawyers, we have some social workers on our team too, but when we look at this problem, we're looking at it at first from a legal lens, right? All our legal education is influencing how we're seeing the problem. So we first have our students try to stand in the shoes of someone experiencing medical debt. Check what you know. Ask yourself to start, how is my experiencing influencing how I'm seeing this problem? and then walk through someone's shoes who's experiencing medical debt. Think about how they feel, think about the obstacles they have, think about their environment, and think about all those things. And then ask yourself, what assumptions am I making and what do I need to know? And the next thing that we do is we go out and we talk to people experiencing medical debt. We really check all those assumptions and we try to fill in those knowledge gaps and learn about medical debt from their perspective. But again, medical debt is a really serious, complex problem. We're not going to solve medical debt by just talking to people experiencing medical debt. We have to talk to all the stakeholders involved. We have to talk to judges. We have to talk to collectors. We have to talk to profit and non-for-profit providers. We have to talk to self-help resources. We have to talk to community service providers that are helping people navigate the non-legal forms of medical debt. And by taking a no villains approach and including all of those stakeholders, even those who seem to have opposing interests, like for say creditors versus people who are experiencing medical debt, we really get to see where is their consensus. What we learned from this is we learned that people experiencing medical debt are afraid to pick up the phone for creditors for a number of reasons. They either hear that creditors are terrible, they're afraid to, deal with the bill, they don't know the consequences, they think that if they don't answer the phone, then it'll just go away, or they're just too overwhelmed to want to deal with it. On the flip side of things, creditors would love them to know that they would love to pick up that call and negotiate, because it's actually better for them to negotiate and settle than it is for them to go to court. They waste resources and time going to court, and sometimes they don't end up getting any of the money. So for them, talking is actually like key to solving things quickly and in a sort of fair way. If we didn't talk to collectors, a group that's normally villainized when you think about people experiencing medical debt, we wouldn't have found that area of consensus. We wouldn't have learned that a lot of stakeholders in the system are thinking that there needs to be communication sooner. And we wouldn't have found leverage points to deliver impact in that sort of system. For example, when our team is ideating a few possible solutions, but one thing they're thinking of doing is a diversion program where they could give non-lawyer advocates legal advice to assist someone before a case is filed. So someone who is experiencing medical debt, normally they have a case filed and then they receive a summons and then they go to court, or they don't go to court. Our idea is to stop that process early and have creditors meet and confer with the person that is experiencing medical debt and this non-lawyer advocate, so they can hopefully come to a settlement before it goes to court, when there's really no options and there's not much you can do at that point.
Right, Mackenzie, that's such a great example of a couple different habits. One of them is understanding like the circular nature of complex cause and effect relationships. So really, for example, with the creditor call, that came to mind right away when you were first talking, that because of that negative experience, they're not picking up, then more negative experiences happen, and then they don't pick up more because they're more scared, they're fearful of it happening again. And that really creates that vicious cycle or that feedback loop. And then you also touched on a little bit when you were talking about getting all those perspectives together, how a system structure really generates its behavior, specifically that the organization and the interactions of the different stakeholders create those new behaviors. You talked about, when you talk to everybody, you created a structure that everyone's voice is heard, and that's how we drive decisions. So you designed a solution that involved medical debt collectors. Imagine if you hadn't, they're a key stakeholder. So if they weren't bought into what the group had decided to move forward with, it wouldn't have moved forward. So you're still working towards that same goal and helping people who have medical debt, but you're doing it by making changes to the system so that behavior is kind of organically occurring over time.
Yeah, I think that's like one of our goals, is to see like you said, like where's their consensus and where can we shift mental models so that the system is actually working not in a vicious cycle, but in a helpful cycle, in a way that's like empowering all systems. Like we know that we're not going to solve medical debt and experience, like we're not going to be able to eliminate all medical debt in Utah, but by talking to all the stakeholders and trying to find those opportunities for change and those areas where the systems can agree on a point that can deliver impact, then we can actually make small incremental changes that have impacts and that can be scalable and replicable, and we can go from there.
Right, and that's kind of, you mentioned the word earlier, and you're kind of talking about it now, is like the leverage points, which I think really highlights a key part of systems thinking, and that's working within what the system's telling you and not solely what's coming from the outside. And another benefit of that too is because you've learned the system well enough to identify leverage points, so you're going to have a better idea of what the impact of whatever actions are being taken is going to have on the system, which is another really crucial component of creating sustainable systems change. Mackenzie and I were talking about this in the planning with any project. It's always really important to ask, what does the evaluation look like? Have you created assessment tools? Do you have indicators or benchmarks? Have you collectively defined success? I know that's a really cool activity actually to do with stakeholders and systems thinking is what does an ideal world look like? What would success look like for you moving forward? And defining that collectively, or even identifying different benchmarks and indicators depending on the project. And this checking of the results and changes and seeing if action is needed is really what the successive approximation looks like, that habit. And that's really how you see the long-term impact of your work. It's observing how elements change over time and generate new patterns and trends. And that's crucial if you really want to move towards sustainable systems change.
Yeah, and we just talked about this the other day, and I forgot to mention that actually right after this call, I have to jump to an evaluation workshop where we're going to be planning how we're going to do empirical evaluation of whichever products move forward after we do like lower scale qualitative testing with stakeholders. So that's what I'm doing after this. But I think that first testing with stakeholders, even not the empirical methods, but the more just like quick assumption testing and the testing of like models of your idea, engaging those stakeholders early so that you can keep reiterating your design and keep changing your design based on their feedback. I think that is also really important. And I think that's something that people are hesitant to do, or they're quick to jump to a solution they think is really good. Maybe they've even talked to stakeholders and they think they've landed on a great solution, and then they build it and they put all this time and resources in it, and they never took it back to the community to say, hey, am I on track? And what can happen then is you spend time and resources building a solution that doesn't actually work or isn't wanted by the community. So I think an important part of the systems thinking and the design system process that we do on our social justice work is really engaging the community in co-creation at every point. When we're thinking about the problem, when we're defining the problem, when we're ideating possible solutions, before we build it, we're going to prototype it, we're going to make a model of it and bring it back to stakeholders and say, hey, what do you like? What do you not like? What's scary? What should be changed? And if they don't like it, we're not afraid to pivot and fail and try something new. So I think those like small steps of evaluation are as important, so that when you do that long-term evaluation, you know that something is working, something is not working because of something, not just because you didn't design it well and you didn't design it with the community in mind.
Right, and that, like you said, that that evaluation piece is happening during, and everything we just talked about, all these different habits and processes are happening over and over again. So it's not just a one and done. Like I've tested my assumptions in the beginning. You keep doing it, and that co-creation, that kind of is what co-creation is. And Mackenzie and I said that systems thinking is what really opens the door to what co-creation happens. And I know that with systems thinking, it takes time, right? It takes time to create something alongside a community. And we really view ourselves as facilitators of a process. The community or whoever we're working with in the system, they own the whatever comes out of it. We're just here to help them see those different lenses. And that takes time. And I think honestly in my work, again, consulting and teaching, that's one of the biggest pushbacks I always get is that takes way too much time. I don't have time to do that. We're just going to try something and work back later. And I understand that. Many people think they don't have time because they're obligated to funders, or they have deadlines to meet, or they have to meet, report back to somebody in time to keep the program afloat. They're beholden to a system they're in. And I understand that. And I always tell those people, well, what you don't invest in the beginning, you'll invest in the middle and the end twofold, whether that's time, resources, money. And one of the main reasons being is that when you take action without fully understanding the dynamics of the system, you don't consider the perspectives and issues fully. And this often means that both the short-term and long-term consequences were not fully considered either. And that's where I see the most damage done in my work, particularly to relationships. Again, one of the projects in, my first project ever with Engineers Without Borders in Guatemala, we work with the Ixil people who endured a civil war and a lot of things in present day as well. So when we went in the first time, talking about how we were going to help build a water system, many people said, I don't believe you. You're the fourth person to come here and tell me you're going to do it. You're just another person giving me broken promises. And that's neither our fault. That was done from somebody else not considering impacts and not considering the issue fully. And we felt that years later, and zooming out to the development work in general, both my work and Mackenzie's work, historical things that were done, before we were even born, to be honest, impacts our work today. So I think that's another really big reason why we should really advocate for taking that systems lens and just pausing and taking our time, because that impact, we have no idea what our impact could actually be. And with that, we definitely want to make sure we leave time for questions. So before our closing thoughts, we want to take about 15 to 20 minutes to answer any questions you may have. So if you have a question, feel free to use the chat box or to unmute yourself.
So it looks like I've been monitoring the chat. It looks like we have a question from a few, Bill, Anna, and Veronica. If any of you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Hey everybody, this is Veronica. Sorry, I'm trying to turn on my camera. So thanks for bringing all of us together, Water Center, and to the speakers for taking the time to share your expertise with us. I really appreciate having access to all of you. And my question is, I'm just interested in hearing more elaboration on, once you have gone through the exercise to empathize with so many complex perspectives, and you mentioned that you are looking for consensus, opportunities for having impact, like what kind of disciplined activity did you go through to identify those areas where there is a consensus or opportunity for impact? Can you share a little bit more about that with us?
Do you want to go?
I can start. So with our interdisciplinary teams, what we do is we have students write up summaries of their interviews and do like empathy maps of their stakeholders, what they learned, and then we share that with everyone. And from there, we do what is called a point of view statement. So we ask students to walk through the point of view of something that struck them in their interview. And we go from there and we try to define like what's upstream and downstream of that problem that struck them. And from there, we look at all those upstream downstreams and we have students try to identify an opportunity for impact. And then when we do that after all of the people we talk to, and we bring it together, and then we do an activity called How Might We? And that is something where we bring those opportunities, everyone collects them, like we're using this app Miro, which I love right now for virtual. It's like, imagine like a live sticky board app. So our students can collaborate like they were in a classroom in real time, just putting ideas up. And so
what's the name of that? What's the name of the app you mentioned?
It's called Miro. I just entered it in the chat.
Oh, Mural. Gotcha. Okay, sorry for that.
Miro's really great. Yeah.
But we have students think about how might we do this, like how might we achieve this opportunity? And we don't want them to like sit there and think very hard for a long time about the best answer. We just want them to ideate wildly and think creatively, go for quantity, not quality. And then from there, what we do is we sort those ideas based on feasibility and impact. And we also look at our assumptions. What assumptions are we making? Which one of these with high feasibility and high impact are the riskiest assumptions? And then we go from there, and we just keep trying to narrow our ideas down from that big creative pile of ideas that we start with. And then we take those ideas back to the community and we test some of those assumptions, and then we bring that feedback back. And then we revise our ideas and we bring them back, and we just keep doing that until we think we've had something that the community feels that that has been co-designed with the community, not just designed for them.
Yeah, and I think too, when I'm working in, I think situations often where perhaps there's like a contentious relationship, or maybe these people aren't always working together, first finding those shared values and shared interests, and then kind of building from there. Because let's say, for example, the International Water Center I mentioned earlier, when I did all of those interviews, when we transcribed and we kind of did a similar thing, we actually put sticky notes on the wall as a team. We're like, okay, here are all of the different things people want, and there's not a lot in common. But we made sure that when we were talking to stakeholders and trying to understand their perspectives, asking them like, what do you value most? What's most important to you? Or when they ask questions, when we ask questions about what do you want this water center to look like, they say, I want to be able to share my results in Europe. I'm like, so what value makes you say that? And they're like, I think I want people to learn about how beautiful this place is. And when we talked to an Indigenous group, they were saying something similar, and they had a similar value, saying, well, we want people to understand how beautiful and diverse and how this place is worth protecting. And what we were able to find by digging deeper into what's the value or experience driving that is that many of these stakeholders, even some who had very, again, contentious relationships with each other, something that some of them had in common was we want to make this place known as something worth protecting. So when we were able to frame conversations through that, we made actually like a lot of headway in that group visioning session. So doing similar activities like what Mackenzie said, where you write down what you think the water center should have and things like that, but really setting the stage and setting people up for success by showing what they have in common. That's something that's really helpful when I'm trying to build consensus in my work.
Really helpful. And hey, Mackenzie, just to clarify, when you're talking about that feasibility and impact, are you talking about like feasibility x-axis, impact y-axis type of an exercise in quadrants? Okay.
And if we're talking about Miro, the students are just taking like their pile of ideas and then moving them around, and then they kind of zone in then that hard and impactful and that easy and impactful, and they look at those sections to deliver change.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And I had a question as well. I'm Bill Potopchik, and the question I put into chat, which I'm curious about, my sense in the systems thinking worlds I've been a part of is there's different schools. Different people approach systems thinking differently. And Mackenzie, with your work on eviction, I'm familiar with work that was done a while ago on homelessness, which obviously overlaps with eviction. And I put a link into chat and I don't know if this is appropriate. I'll just pop it up very briefly. This is your session. But it's causal loop mapping, trying to understand where are the opportunities for leverage. And what it led to in part was just a complete rethink of how one addresses homelessness from a set of support that those who are losing access to housing or don't have housing, and how they find those supports to one would, and they often have to go through certain activities before they're eligible for housing. And this was one of the early systems thinking exercises that led to the housing first notion, that you can't do any of these steps unless you're in a comfortable, safe housing situation. So I was curious, as you dug into eviction and systems thinking, whether this work crossed your radar and thoughts on the different ways of approaching systems thinking.
Yeah, so I definitely haven't seen what you just put on the screen, but I think that is like kind of some of the driving behind this. Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. So I think our thoughts were, we know like all the human consequences like of eviction, and we know that eviction, while not all evictions result in homelessness, it is a leading cause of homelessness, and evictions increase the risk of homelessness. I know in some of the studies we used to go from 18% to 25% of people who are faced with eviction are going to face disruptive displacement and need shelter and other social safety nets. So I think it comes into our work in knowing that you have to keep people housed, because like once you take someone out of their home, you increase like the risk for all of these other social safety nets, their needs for these other social safety nets, such as like child welfare, for example. When you take a home who's already financially strained and who has children, and then you take them out of their home, you increase the likelihood that that family is going to interact with the social
Sure.
with child welfare system, as well as like, you know, increasing like the child doesn't have an adequate housing, but also the child like might face some of the parent's stress might get taken out on the child. Sorry, that was not a clear response, but
That's
yeah.
okay. Very helpful, Mackenzie. Thank you.
Well, and something I know, I did some work with the Urban Economic Development Association of Milwaukee on eviction, and we did a systems analysis so that service providers could more effectively allocate resources to help those immediately facing eviction. And one of the biggest things that we found was that getting to the resources was one of the harder parts too. And I think that's something I bring up because I know a lot of systems work, especially focused on nonprofits and such like that. That's one of the big obstacles, is how does somebody who doesn't have a home get to the bus to get to these 5 different areas they have to go to get help. And that was just something that I was thinking about when you brought up that loop there, Bill.
We saw the same thing actually with when we looked at survivors of human trafficking. Like how do you expect a survivor of human trafficking who has some of the most complex social needs to go find all of these resources that advocates that work in this field don't even know where to send them? Like how do you expect them to not circle back and get back into a game when they're at every turn they don't know where to go? Like they need a resource, but there's requirements to get that resource, and there's also just like when you find a resource, they don't know where else to send you when they can't handle your needs.
Great. So I've been monitoring the chat. Chris, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Joanne. I worked with Drea on I do eviction mediation work in Milwaukee, and I also teach in the Sustainable Peace Building program. And one of the things that was really helpful of doing the mapping work with Drea for our group was it helped a group of stakeholders that are all connected yet disconnected to see the connections and to better understand how we can collaborate more efficiently and more effectively, because we tend to focus on a really granular level on what we're doing because it's so kind of mission critical and helping people that we lose a little bit of that zoomed out perspective. So it also helps when you're bringing stakeholders together to pull everybody a little bit out and think a little bit more slowly and a little bit more carefully. And interestingly, as a result of some of those processes right now with COVID, that collaboration helped to really, really significantly bridge some connectivity issues. And we have been very successful in doing a lot of work in Milwaukee. And in fact, we're in the process right now of creating a rental housing resource center with the apartment association, the stakeholders on the legal service provider side, mediation, advocates, all these groups, because we started to actually get to know one another better through some of these processes. So it has a lot of collateral benefit. So I just had to pipe up and share that insight. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanne. Any other questions? I know Chris had a question in the chat. Chris, did you want to ask?
Sure. And I know Waters Foundation is very supportive of this work.
Sure.
And I have a lot of my peers on the call. So I was interested in hearing from Alexandria and Mackenzie or anyone from industry. Part of our struggle is to bring ways of thinking to the forefront in elementary and middle and high school education. So in K-12 education, there tends to be a zoom in focus, right, on micro level standards. And so I'd be interested in hearing on your thoughts on how K-12 education might help support this type of thinking, because it clearly is important in the work that you're doing. Oh, Alexandria, yeah.
So when you say how K-12 can support it, do you mean teaching it in K-12, educators, students, or all of the above?
All of the above, really. So our work is to bring it to kids, but that work also includes like persuading those in charge that this is where they work.
Right. And I think I'm glad you asked that question, because I think it's one we ask ourselves and is asked often, is how do you get people to buy in? And I think one key aspect, kids are really persuasive with their parents usually. I was recently doing consultancy work for UWM with their K through 12 global education outreach. And when we talked about things like global citizenship and restorative justice and things like that, we gave one of the assignments for the kids was to have a conversation with their parents about what they learned and say what their parents thought about it. And it was interesting how many parents came back and they're like, hey, this sounds kind of interesting. Can you send me some more information on it? Administration. So I fully admitting I've worked with educators. I'm not an educator myself. I know how challenging that can be to really shift that system. I see that a lot with restorative justice work as well, is how do you change those mental models? And I think part of it is, again, latching on to what already is there that is systems thinking. Because like I said earlier, it is inherent. We already are kind of exercising these habits and using that muscle. So maybe on your end, because it seems like you have some knowledge of systems thinking, what are the habits or things that they're doing that they like to do, that are working, that are actually systems thinking? So for example, with I was talking to somebody about communication, a business I was consulting with, and they were doing kind of the reflective piece. Like, I'm hearing you say, I was like, hey, you're testing assumptions right there. They're like, what do you mean? I was like, well, you're making sure you didn't assume what you heard from me, or something like that. And they're like, oh, I'm like, yeah, that's actually part of systems thinking. And I just went to this interesting talk. Can I send you an article on it? I think it's great what you're doing. So you're kind of like reaffirming them, but also showing them, I think, extending empathy to that other side when you're asking to change the system, quickly or entirely. They're like, I can't do that. The answer is almost always no. But if you show them they're already kind of doing it, I think that's really helpful. It's been helpful in my experience.
And the only thing I would add to that is I feel like this is something that Drea and I experienced in our prep for this. Like when she was talking to me with this extensive systems thinking background, I was a little bit intimidated. I was questioning, okay, I'm going to present with this girl who studied this in undergrad, who took it in graduate school, who's been all over the world. Her job is systems thinking. And I learned the word systems thinking a year ago. So this is new to me and I'm super intimidated, and I'm a little bit intimidated by the lingo and the language. And something that I noticed is when Drea and I started talking, and we started talking about how we think about problems and how we apply the habit tools to our problems, that just made me realize that we're on the same wavelength, and we're thinking about the same things, and we're using the same tools already, which made it not as exclusive and included me into the conversation. And I think that could be a way to start to, people might just be intimidated. Like if you're bringing it on as this is this new advanced way of thinking, and you have all of this knowledge about it, you could intimidate other people who are scared of new things or scared of new thinking. And if you do what Drea said, where you approach them with like, you're already doing some of this thinking, this is natural. And then you just give them the tools like to help you remember that you like to take those actions and to think that way as you're going through your thinking, then I think it makes it more approachable and more accessible.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? A lot of great resources being shared in the chat. So I encourage everyone at the end, you save your chat so you can refer to those later.
Thank you. Yes, I also would like a question. So thank you very much, first of all, for sharing your expertise. This is a bit general, so I already had some answers in the chat. Thank you, but I will pose the question. So I'm learning systems thinking. From my experience, it's a very different way of thinking. So it takes time to get into. So for me, it has been not full time, but over the years, so a little bit. And my question is, so if you have the opportunity to, if you have a community, or if you are building a community to tackle a specific problem, but they are new to systems thinking, what would you recommend as a starting point, for instance, or a kind of approach, or in terms of also time frame? What could you expect, for instance, within 3 months to do like 3 workshops to introduce slowly so that eventually the community could tackle it and also learn system thinking? What would you suggest? Thank you.
I think I just have 2 follow-up questions, if you don't mind, Anna. So one, I would want to understand who your community is, but also what's the goal of introducing systems thinking?
Okay, so yes, thank you. I will clarify. So I have a background in eco-design and circular economy, and I have a research proposal, which the goal is through a multi-stakeholder community, with and for that community, to contribute, and through a more system thinking, but also more dynamics approach to tackle the issues. And from my perspective, there are very complex issues from multiple perspectives. And the idea is to bring the knowledge from the community, but also to tackle it through these different approaches to have solutions.
So kind of like bridge building and also problem solving together type thing. Well, I think personally, timeline is going to be, it's kind of listening to the system. So going back to seeing how fast people pick up on it. But maybe, you know, establishing a shared understanding is a big one. So the cool part about systems thinking is that you can teach and use systems thinking while doing other things. So for example, I want everyone to know, what do you think the problem is? Right? So you're getting those different perspectives, that systems thinking. So as you're kind of facilitating that conversation, maybe, and establishing that shared understanding, you're helping others see perspectives. You're learning the different perspectives, and hopefully you're understanding some of the mental models at play. And what you can do is, after debrief, if you want them to learn the tools of systems thinking, and say, so what we just did there was systems thinking. So kind of showing like, look, you just did it, and that these are the different concepts you've used. I know that's a method I've used a lot with facilitation or with different conflict resolution activities. We'll usually go through it, and then I'll talk after about how you could use this tool, this activity we just did, or these concepts we just talked about in your work. I don't know if that makes sense or answers your question.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, Anna. It looks like Anne has a question in the chat for Mackenzie. So when you shared about starting with empathy interviews and continued with the process for understanding the issues, can you share these resources and activities that you referenced?
I should have prepared them ahead of time, but I, of course, can share them with the Water Center afterwards and ask them to send it out to all the participants. I think we have a list of resources, so maybe we can share it in one bunch.
Sure.
And actually, because I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, that leads really well into the next portion, or closing thoughts. And also, if there's any questions we didn't get to, Mackenzie and I talked, and we would be happy to maybe find a way to answer the questions you posed in the chat, and we can work with people at Waters to make sure you get those answers. So speaking of resources, Mackenzie and I did come up with a little list of resources that we go to, some of our frequently used, to kind of cut through the fog. Some of these I saw were already mentioned in the chat, and I'm going to post them right in here. Oh, the links didn't show up, but we'll make sure we get those to you. And of course, we want to talk a little bit about one that you're pretty familiar with, the Water Center. So some of you may or may not know, their website has a lot of good resources. They have the open studios like this. They mentioned earlier the Leading for Impactful Change Studio series that I would 100% recommend. But the reason we also wanted to highlight Waters was because it's a great place to build your community of practice. And I think, Mackenzie, you had mentioned a lot how community is really important in your work.
Yeah, I mean, community is essential to our work, and engaging the community in our work is essential. And I think systems thinking gives me the tools to do that effectively, and leading, and how I can do that by leading with empathy. But it's also taught me the importance of having like a really strong systems thinking community. and having a strong group of like your innovator friends who you can go to when you're dealing with a complex problem. You can talk about ideas with them, or like Drea was talking about earlier, if you feel that you can't be open to something or you're not understanding something, you can lean on one of those, your interdisciplinary teams, or you're just systems thinking friends, and ask them to try to walk through the situation with you or like without you, and try to approach it differently. And I just feel like it's just a completely new way of having a community. And that's why I'm really excited for this Water Center presentation, because I know Sherry Martin has presented to our class, I think now 3 times. And I've loved all of the presentations. And when she invited me, I was just like, oh, more opportunity to meet more systems thinking friends. And actually in preparation for this, I feel like I've really gained a systems thinking friend through Alexandria. And in our conversations, she's said, oh, that reminds me, I have 2 friends who do this here. Oh, I have a friend over here who does this. So our systems thinking circle is just expanding because we're being inclusive and we're welcoming people like me who are new, and this is a new concept, but inviting me to the conversation. And I love that.
Well, and too, I have to say, working with Mackenzie, I've also, like, my circle is growing, but just seeing too how systems thinking is applied in different areas, because you never know the overlap. I mean, Mackenzie and I talking, even though we had very different entry points into systems thinking, I learned so much from her about like, oh, so this is how you apply it in this type of industry. And oh, I could maybe even do that over here in public health. I never even thought of that. So just like, you never even know the connections. And it honestly gets really exciting to meet people who you can talk to about this. I know growing up, before I found my little systems thinking community, I was always called really random or tangential, because, you know, you just start connecting things in your head. And to your point, Mackenzie, I think systems thinking really gives you the tools to understand people and community. But I really want to emphasize how systems thinking really helps you understand yourself. You know, for me personally, it really gave me this sense of both relief and responsibility, especially to how I show up in the world. Because systems thinking constantly reminds you of that things are changing and that it's impossible to control everything, because so much is contributing to the state of the system. We see one little lens through our perspective, but there's all these things contributing. And I think, you know, systems thinking taught me to not judge that instinct to control things, right? I think who's heard like, oh, they're a control freak, I don't like working with them, or, oh, that's so annoying. But really, control is kind of a safety blanket or a defense mechanism, because it's frightening to think that you're existing in the world and you can't control everything. But that's where, you know, that community that Mackenzie's talking about, but kind of that relief that, wow, if I can really only control myself, I better do that really, really well. And that's where the responsibility piece came into me, is because I realize now, just existing and interacting with people, I'm affecting systems that I don't even know I'm a part of, or I'm having impacts on other people in the world that I can't even begin to understand. And I think about that often, honestly, daily. And it's, you know, it's asking myself, am I leading from a place that resonates with my values? Am I thinking of others to the best of my ability? And again, giving yourself grace if you mess up, because it's impossible to see the whole system. But if you're trying really hard to empathize and to see that, and I guess I always just ask, am I leading from a place of love and kindness whenever possible? And those questions are going to be different for everyone. It's just that introspection and kind of systems thinking yourself is when I start seeing big change. And I think we'll start seeing big change happening in the world when we recognize our interconnectedness and have more conversations with ourselves. And I think when we realize that a small action can have a mighty impact, and that many small actions can have an even greater one. So with that, we want to pass it over to Alexis, and thank you all so much for coming and giving your expertise and questions. Again, we will be sharing some resources with you that we mentioned here. Again, thank you so much for your time. It's always great being among a big group of systems thinkers.
Thank you so much to Alexandria and Mackenzie. I think I speak for everyone when I say such a privilege to hear you share your experience and expertise and your passion, and for bringing us all together for this today. So thank you so much. Before just some closing announcements, I know there's been a ton of resources shared in the chat, so please be sure to save it. And you can do that by finding the 3 little dots near the chat box, the type message here box, and it'll prompt you to save your chat. So be sure you do that. I am going to share my screen for some closing announcements. Alrighty, so every other Tuesday is TTS Tuesday, and that's where we send out a newsletter with new announcements, kind of what's happening with the Water Center, resources, things like that. So keep your eye out because the next TTS Tuesday is November 10th. The next Open Studio, again, these are monthly, will be Thursday, December 3rd. And the next Teacher Studio, which for those of you that don't know, this is quite a new initiative. It's similar to Open Studio, but the focus is really on issues relevant to educators. So looking at things through an educator's lens. Those are the first Saturday of every month. So the next Teacher Studio is December 5th, and details and registration will be coming soon for that. So we'll be sure to send out information. And, so much today, Alexandria and Mackenzie talked about, bringing stakeholders together, breaking down silos, coming to a shared understanding. And we are happy to announce that we are holding our second forum. We held one back in September focused on early childhood. We have one coming up Thursday, February 11th, focused on equitable healthcare. So there's a bunch of information on this screen, and we'll be sure to send a link right now, which will have even more information and a save the date form. If you're interested, registration's not up yet, but be sure to secure your spot if you are interested. And it's just an opportunity for anyone that has any sort of stake or interest in a healthcare system, which is extremely broad, and we've kind of have a list of who should attend under there, to come together and explore perspectives around equitable healthcare systems, discover how the habits and tools of systems thinking can be applied to this effort, so on and so forth. So more detailed information, including an agenda, guest speakers, will be announced soon. But in the meantime, I will put a link in the chat to save your spot. And Thea?
Yep. So as always, here at the Water Center, we practice the habit of successive approximation. So in your inbox right now, actually, there is a brief survey. It'll take 2 to 3 minutes to complete. If you could complete that survey to give us feedback on this session, what you liked, what we could improve on, that would be really great. And thank you all so much for coming.
And thank you again to Alexandria and Mackenzie. So grateful for your time and your energy. And thank you everyone for joining us.